right, so today we are going to continue with our discussion of producer theory. And today we're going to move beyond the unrealistic case of perfect competition to the somewhat more realistic case of monopoly. Now, we've been discussing perfect competition thus far as a form of market organization, and that makes sense in some contexts like fast food and other things. But in most contexts, we think perfect competition is not the way the world works. We think there's some limits on competition. And we think that many markets for many of the goods we consume have only a few firms. Operating systems or cars or a lot of the things we consume typically have only a few firms in them. So the most realistic model of markets would be one which accounts for the fact that there's less than an infinite number of firms, there's only a few firms. That turns out also to be the hardest model. So what we do is we sort of iterate there. We started with with one extreme, which is a competitive market where there's an infinite number of firms. That allows us to draw some interesting conclusions. Now we're going to reverse field and talk about the other extreme, monopoly. Well, there's only one firm. Okay, we'll talk about monopoly markets, there's only one firm. Then we'll talk about oligopoly, that middle case, where there's multiple firms. Okay, so let's talk about monopoly, a market where there's only one firm. And the key distinction from monopolies, the key things to know about, the key thing to remember from monopolies is they're no longer price takers. They're now price makers. Competitive firms were price takers. They were given a price by the market, and they reacted to that. And as we saw in the long run, that price settled at the minimum of average costs. So basically, they were given the price, which dictated production efficiency. They reacted to that and how much they produced. You got a flat long-run supply curve. Okay? However, in a monopoly market, we don't meet the conditions for perfect competition. In particular, one condition was that consumers had perfect substitutes between your good and other goods they could buy. That's not true in a monopoly market. If you remember, the profit maximizing condition that we derived when we started our competition lectures was that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay? That was our profit maximizing condition, was that marginal revenue equal marginal cost. Okay? Now we're going to go to, and in perfect competition, okay, so basically, and the way we thought about this marginal revenue equals marginal cost, remember the logic was this notion of climbing this profit hill. You want to produce any unit. Think of yourself as climbing this profit hill. You're deciding, do I produce the next unit? And I produce the next unit as long as the money I make off that unit exceeds what it costs to produce that unit. So I climb that profit hill. If marginal revenue equals marginal cost, is greater than marginal cost, I keep going up. At the peak, marginal revenue will equal marginal cost. Once I go beyond that peak, marginal revenue will fall down below marginal cost, and I'll stop producing. So the notion is I climb this hill, which in the peak is dictated by marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay? Now, for a competitive firm, we said marginal revenue was just price. So in perfect competition, the rule was set price equal to marginal cost. Okay? But that was a particular case of marginal revenue. So for example, to see that, let's look at figure 14.1. Okay? This is another way, it's probably next year when I teach this, I'll put this in the lecture on competition. Just a way to think about how marginal revenue is price. Remember, a perfectly competitive firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. Okay? They face a perfectly elastic demand curve. So they have to think about what the implications are of the marginal unit they sell. Well, if they sell little q units, their revenue is A. If they sell one more unit, their revenue is B. And the marginal revenue is the height of that rectangle B, okay, times the base. The base is 1, because it goes from q plus 1. The height is P. So the marginal revenue is price. Okay, this is a pretty basic diagram. Okay, so marginal revenue is price for the perfectly competitive firm. Now let's look at the monopoly case. The difference with a monopolist, as you see in figure 14.2, is they no longer face a perfectly elastic demand curve. They now face a downward sloping demand curve. Why is that? Well, remember, this is the graph for little q. The reason the graph for little q was perfectly elastic with a perfectly competitive case was not that we said that demand for the entire good was perfectly elastic. It's just that the residual demand facing any one firm was perfectly elastic. Well, now a monopolist is the only firm in the market. So their residual demand equals total demand. their residual demand equals total demand. So as long as total demand is downward sloping, as we typically think it is, then they'll face a downward sloping demand curve. Okay? So unlike a perfectly competitive firm, which faces a perfectly elastic residual demand curve, a monopoly firm will face a downward sloping market demand curve. They face the entire market demand curve. So this is demand curve. Now we're talking about big Qs, not little q's anymore. Or we could say little q equals big Q. There's only one firm. So little q's and the big Q's are the same. So now the firm reacts not to its residual firm demand curve, which is flat, but the downward sloping market demand curve. Now, we're going to make one assumption here that's very important. We'll come back to this at the end of the lecture. We're going to assume that the monopolists can only charge one price for their good to all consumers. So most of this lecture, we're going to assume a non-price discriminating monopolist. Let's think about his decision to produce another unit. He's originally producing at Q, big Q at a price P1. Okay? He's originally producing at big Q at a price P1. If he wants to sell one more unit, he's going to have to lower the price because he now faces a downward sloping demand curve. So if he wants to sell one more unit, he's going to have to lower the price to P2. What's that going to do? Well, on the one hand, what that's going to do is that's going to mean on that next unit, he's going to make P2. So he's going to get the rectangle B. On the other hand, on all the units he was selling at P1, he now gets a lower price P2. So he loses the rectangle C. So the marginal revenue for this monopolist, the marginal revenue is equal to the rectangle B minus the rectangle C. Okay? The marginal revenue is rectangle B minus rectangle C. Or alternatively, you could say that if we just write out what that is, that's P2, okay, minus P1 minus P2 times Q1. We could rewrite this then as marginal revenue equals P plus delta P, okay, delta Q, how much the price changes when you change the quantity, times the original quantity Q1. Okay? Or one more time, just using, if we do this, for those of you who prefer calculus, if revenue equals P times Q, and Q is a function of P, then marginal revenue, differentiating that, is P plus dP dQ times Q. Okay? So marginal revenue is the price plus the change in price from selling another unit times the initial quantity. Okay? So the graphics, once again, the graphics are in this graph. The math is here. We just differentiate the revenue equation. Okay? This term is positive. Price is always greater than 0. Okay? But this term is negative because demand curves slope down. So there's now two effects. There's a positive effect, which is if I sell another unit, I make money on that other unit. There's a negative effect, which is to sell that other unit, I have to lower the price because I face downward sloping demand. Okay? So there's two effects of monopolist as he thinks about wanting to sell that another unit. Okay? There's the money from that unit, but the lower willingness to pay for all previous units. And that's what makes a monopolist a little more interesting. Okay? We basically think of the monopolist as basically having to work down the demand curve. With a perfectly competitive firm, they don't have to work down the demand curve. The demand's flat to them. They can sell as much as they want at that price because they don't affect the price. They want to sell 10 at that price or 1 million at that price, it doesn't matter. Their demand curve's flat. Not true for the monopolist. If the monopolist wants to sell more, he has to face the wrath of the market. Okay? And the wrath of the market is such that if he wants to sell more, he's going to have to lower the price to do so. What the monopolist is going to want to do is draw a marginal revenue curve. Okay? With the perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue curve was just the price. It was given to them. There's no marginal revenue curve. For monopolists, there is a marginal revenue curve. So here I have a demand curve.